welcome to Dwell Church of the Peninsula. I've almost lost track of exactly what Sunday it is, but I don't think it's 30 yet, but we're somewhere within the still very much a little baby phase, and so I'm grateful that you all are here to witness this part of our journey. My name is Matt Stefan. As I said, I'm part of the leadership team. We are in second week of a set of teachings we're calling You and Me and Everyone We Know, where we're talking about our core value of diversity. What does that mean for our church, the community that we are building, maybe even for the world, the vision we are casting to be a new church for a new era. Before we jump into any of that, I want to give you some updates about the Dwell Church comings and goings. On September 8th, we will be in a new location, George Hall Elementary School. I think we tried to whip up a picture, but did we get a picture? Yes. Okay, we're going to pull up That's the playground. Okay, there it is. Look how pretty that is. Oh, it's lovely. Multi-purpose building at George Hall Elementary. They have 380 little screamers running around every day there, and we're going to do everything we can to partner with them and bless them. And they're even letting us play on that playground. So this is a strategic investment. Look at that. Look at that. It's going to be amazing. Okay, this is kind of a strategic investment in a couple things. One, we want to continue to embed ourselves in this community. We want to be a church where people feel like they know that we're blessing them, they know we're in their corner. The principal here is kind of an old friend, so that's kind of a natural relationship, really great. And we're going to explore all kinds of ways to partner with the student body, the parents there, all of it. We're going to really try to bless this school. And also, it's an investment in Dwell Kids. As you might know, if you've been tracking along, we have way too many kids for a church plant of our age and size. So that is so much fun. That is such a blessing. And we want to be providing better facilities for them to run and play, to have some separate environments. So we're going to be much happier there. And this is a big step forward for Dwell Church. So we, over the summer, were working on our sustainability campaign. How do we put this thing on really sustainable footing? And if you were thinking about, I want to give financially, partnership in some way with Dwell Church through this sustainability plan that we were working on, or if you don't have a job yet here at Dwell Church, we're going to hunt you down. This is going to take all of us. So we hope that you will continue to build Dwell Church in one way, shape, or form. We have retired the word volunteer from the vernacular here. None of us are just volunteering or donating little bits of time or resources. We're building something. And if we pay attention to the story that the Bible tells about churches, churches are a place where God dwells in a different way. So how do we together build something where Jesus' presence can be magnified in our own lives, but also in the world that we live in? That's what we're working on. And on September 8th, we're going to start doing it at George Hall Elementary. So that is really pretty exciting. I'm super glad that we're going to be able to do that, have our kids run around on the playground. So we'll be thinking about that. We'll be rolling out a few other things, so stay tuned for some updates. We're really excited about that. One final note about this. We applied for this a year ago, and it was the biggest headache of my entire life for whatever reason. And then about a month ago, we put Brian in charge of it, and he wrapped it up real quick. So it was a Brian miracle. Give it up for Brian. So I don't know what that guy does. Everybody likes him. It was great. So thank you, Brian, for being amazing. All right, let's see. This is working. Okay, you, me, everybody we know, we're jumping into diversity. What does it mean for our lives? What does it mean as it intersects with our faith? Here are the two learning aims for these 3 weeks. First, we want to build a place where everyone can belong. And we've tried to drill down on that concept because it's an easy thing for churches to say that, oh, here everyone can belong. But we've tried to drill down and say, what would it really mean for that to be truly true about Dwell Church? We think it means that people could feel safe and be seen. How do we build a community where people are equipped to see each other and people are consistently feeling seen? That is the mission that we are on. And two, how do we create a vision of the future where this kind of diversity, where everyone is truly seeing each other and feeling seen? How do we build a world where that is integrated deeply into everything that we're doing? What if it is part of the mental furniture, the model that we are working with, that we expect to be able to offer someone, I can see you and you can see me? What if we thought that we could build that here and offer that to the world? That's what we're starting to talk about. So that's what we've been working on. I want to start with the big idea here. Diversity is just better. And here I'm appealing to a large body of research that says diverse teams are smarter, diverse companies make more money, all of that. Here's one example. A study that came out in December of 2023 studied 1,263 companies, that's a lot, across 23 countries, and they concluded diverse companies are 13% more productive, and diverse companies are 36% more likely to outperform. That means to perform above average in their revenue. So really big study. Interestingly, this was the fourth study in a series of studies that started almost 15 years ago, where each time they take a big data set like this and unpack an aspect of diversity in the workplace. So this is a huge study with a lot of good method behind it that tells us something important about human life. That there is something about diversity when we lean into it, when we learn to see each other, that is wildly beneficial to all of us. And I'm making the same case here, that it's super good for your soul. And today we're going to be unpacking the spiritual fruit of living in a diverse community where we are seeing and listening to each other. But let's talk some about last week. Week 1, I tried to cast a vision for what I was calling a Spirit-Filled Intersectional Identity. And here we were talking about this incomplete list, a partial list, of possible elements, fundamental elements of human identity that you and I and everyone we know carry some version of these things in their life. And there could be 10 more here. The ones we could name, though, on this short but partial list: race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, socioeconomics. You and I are given these components, and we are going to, across the journey of our lives, integrate them one way or another. And we were calling this intersectionality, that you exist at the intersection of all these things, or you are the intersection of where all these things come together in your story. And there's things here that we might add, like family of origin types of issues, or all kinds of other ways that you might think, hey, that's an incomplete list. But for all of them, we said something happens when we think about from a spiritual perspective of what a human being is. But last week we said we're only going to focus for now on this core issue of diversity, so we're focusing on race and ethnicity. Last week I mentioned sort of briefly, and some people asked me to unpack it a little bit more, what I was calling the nefarious origins of race. There's a great theologian out of Yale named Willie Jennings, and he did a big project and wrote a book called The Christian Imagination, where he looked at the letters and journals of the very first Europeans on this continent. Late 1400s and early 1500s, they came as European settlers with big colonizing armies, and they were the priests accompanying those armies. And he took a look at those and gave a theological analysis and said these were deeply racist ways of conceiving of Christianity. That for the first white people on this continent, the first thing that they said was, some races are better than others. And they're designed and put on this planet to compete with one another. And so Willie Jennings suggested that the Christian imagination that we have been inheriting since then has been diseased or broken in a way from these original sins of racism built into the way the very first Christians on this continent conceived of our faith. And yet race is one of those things that is omnipresent in our world. As broken as a concept as it is the main way we participate in this conversation. So we're working with that idea, knowing that it's broken, because we have been on this journey to say, what are the ways that we can come to identify ourselves? What is the intersection of our list of things? Now, we were also making a distinction between race and ethnicity, which holds up some. Some people say that race is a way that other people identify you, and ethnicity might be a way that you identify yourself. Although when Keo was correcting me last week, as we'll do again this week, he was noting, actually, you could identify either one of these ways. And this bears witness to the journey that you are personally on, to assemble all of these bits of your identity in an integrated, coherent, life-giving way. And the case I was making last week is that the nature of a human being is to ask for Jesus' help on this journey of putting together who you truly are. So last week, here's kind of an overview. First, we were looking at that very partial list of the elements of your identity. Then we were looking at the idea of what is a human being in the Bible. You were made in the image of God. That's a code word in the Bible that is telling you were made to be filled with the Spirit of God, that you were conceived of as a vessel, a container for God's very presence and Spirit. And that's what Jesus was, and that is the gift he has given to you and I, that we might invite his Spirit to live within us. And what does Jesus do with his Spirit within us in terms of this intersectional identity? Well, he helps us to take a look at all these different parts, all these different bits of our identity, and identify the life-giving parts and to keep those, and to identify the misery-inducing parts of each one of our cultures, and to work against those. And I was suggesting last week an accessible example of this from European culture. My people, they invented the idea of the individual, and that has been a gift to the world in some ways. That has been life-giving in some ways. It created human rights and equality, egalitarianism. But it also has created loneliness and isolation in a sense that I could be on my own, a commitment deeply to self-sufficiency. And what ends up when we commit to self-sufficiency, I think I could be a single person on my own as we miss out on all the God-given benefits of community. There is something life-giving about being an individual, but if we are not careful, there is something misery-inducing about committing to the idea that we are single, independent individuals. And so the big claim we were making is that Jesus is at work in the story of every culture, helping us to filter and process this essential human part of all these bits of our identity. And we took a look at the ways that, very importantly, Jesus carried his ethnic identity, and how at the end of Jesus' story in the book of Revelation, it isn't that there is an abstract, vague humanity gathered in heaven, but every tongue and every tribe and every nation and every people. See, in Jesus' idea of our future, our ethnic identities are not erased, but we are learning to live together in powerful harmony in the presence of Jesus. So that is what it meant to have an identity. We're assembling the Spirit-Filled Intersectional Identity through the journey of our lives in the presence of Jesus. But that isn't quite yet diversity. What is diversity? It's taking those intersectional identities and putting them into conversation with one another. And that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to start to kind of dream about. What if it became really normal to have a insightful, low-temperature, deeply loving conversation from who I might be to who you might be? And that's when we will arrive at diversity. You see, diversity isn't just bodies assembled in a room that fit a certain pie chart. Diversity is a loving community where we are seeing one another. It's our identities in fruitful conversation. And that's what we're going to start to dream about. What if we truly knew each other? What if we truly knew one another's stories? What if that was the expectation of this community? And what if that was the expectation that we gave to the world, that everyone should be equipped to know how to listen and see and learn? What if we made it the standard that we all love each other by listening? That's what we're starting to dream about. Now, we have talked before about how we are in an era of human history where we are all going to experience an unprecedented amount of change. And so part of what we have tried to do is, in this era of unprecedented change, how do we start to imagine what the church of the future is like, and how do we build it today? And what if we set a standard that every follower of Jesus, every community that says it follows Jesus, is capable of listening and loving in this way? We're going to love each other by listening. What do we get when we listen? What do we get when we lean into this diverse moment? I think we're given a gift that is sometimes uncomfortable to receive, but it works like this. The spiritual fruit of diversity is that we can identify and give up implicit bias that disconnects us from each other and from God. See, when we can see each other, then suddenly we can see the implicit bias that we were just given as human beings. And we can lay those down, and we can eliminate the ways that they hold us back from each other and hold us back from God. Now, I've made a mistake right here. So I was supposed to bring a Bible and then read this whole chapter and give 4 observations on it, but I forgot my Bible. So is there anyone willing to loan me a phone? Yes. Oh, yes. Look at these people. I'm just trying to out the good Christians. That's my real strategy. Brought your Bible to church. Yes. Sometimes when people, read our core values, I think they get a certain impression of us. But we are definitely a Bible church. We're going to Bible really hard together. And we're going to embrace that as a way of following Jesus. Okay, here we go. Ephesians chapter 2. Okay, some essential background here. In the ancient world, the Jews had existed for thousands of years, and they were peculiar in a way that they believed in one God. And this created very real tension with the world around them, because the Romans thought of God as many, many. In fact, it was not only a religion for the Romans, it was also part of the way they ran the government. So they considered Jews unpatriotic. that you couldn't worship more than one God. They thought it was peculiar and strange. And over the 200 years around the life of Jesus, there were 5 different wars fought between the Jews and the Romans over the freedom of the Jewish people. So there was a lot of tension there, and even though there were seasons where the Caesar would say, you know what, you guys do whatever you want, it's not worth fighting all these battles. Most of the time, the relationship between Jews and Gentiles was very tense. And partly the Gentiles were insulted because the Jews had very peculiar laws about who they could eat with and when you could wash your hands. And so they were constantly saying, if you Gentiles are around, I literally cannot eat food. So the Jews would huddle together in order to follow these purity laws. And it became a source of great tension. After the movement of Jesus, it became very clear with the story that he was telling that the Hebrew God thought of the world as his creation and all peoples as his people, that Jesus died for everyone. And so they were trying to stitch together these communities of Jews and Gentiles, and someone called the Apostle Paul became a follower of Jesus. He walked on foot from modern-day Turkey to modern-day France. And he planted churches very much like this one, and he wrote letters back to them. And he tried to coach them through the diverse moment of living in a community where the world taught the two halves of the congregation to hate each other, and they'd been doing it for hundreds or thousands of years, and yet how now, in the name of Jesus, we might love one another? What would that even look like? And so in these letters, he wrote back to share. He wrote this to his church in Ephesus. I'll read it and then I'll walk through these 4 things. It's kind of long, but we're going to Bible hard. We're honoring Jose's Bible. Therefore, remember that you who are Gentiles by birth were called the uncircumcision by those who called themselves the circumcision. That which was done to the body by the hands of men, already 2 groups not getting along. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ and excluded from the citizenship of Israel, and foreigners to the covenant of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near through the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the 2 one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the 2, and thus making peace. And in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death all hostility. He came and preached peace to those who are far away and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Holy Spirit. Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself the chief cornerstone. And in him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a temple in the Lord. And in him you two are being built together to become a dwelling place in which God lives by his Spirit. 4 things about this passage. First, Jesus becoming the person who tears down the dividing wall to make one new humanity. Sometimes this has been preached by colonizers to say all of our ethnicities should be erased and we should never again mention anything like that. But we have to remember that at the end of the story, every tribe and tongue and nation and people are there worshiping Jesus, that we aren't losing our ethnicity as one new humanity is made, but we are living into a reality with no hostility. What is new about Jesus' new humanity? There is no hostility. Thing number 2, the Gentiles who are used to looking down their noses at the peculiar Jewish people are reminded quite forcefully here that because of their implicit bias to ignore the Jews, they missed out on God's promises and presence. That you were once far off. Why were they so far off? It wasn't because they weren't allowed in the temple. There was a whole room called the court of the Gentiles. They could have, but they chose not to because they had this sense, this implicit conception of the Jews that they were to be avoided. Here in the diverse moment, the Gentiles are having their implicit bias exposed and invited to move beyond it. And that is the spiritual fruit which our diverse community will bear for one another. You and I will be invited in this community to move beyond such implicit bias. Same for the Jews. Now, if you were somebody who grew up Israelite in these days, you would have had some real problems with Paul writing that Jesus abolished in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. You would have said, what? That can't be right. And here too, they're having their implicit bias questioned, that they made this assumption that God's will was to exclude some people and include others. And that's how they interpreted the law. And here Paul, in this moment of diversity, this cross-cultural experience that they are living into together through the presence and power of the Holy Spirit of Jesus Christ, they are being told, no, I'm sorry, that was completely and utterly incorrect. That's thing number 3. Thing number 4 is that we are, just as they were, being built into a dwelling place for God. Sometimes we will say, it actually doesn't matter what kind of church we plant. It only matters what kind of God we believe in. And here's where we are challenged to embrace this actually pure and beautiful form of our faith, to imagine God to be worth showing up for, worth trusting. Let's imagine God to be who he said he was, the God that can meet us in our deepest desires for him. What if a God who was deeply satisfying and powerfully healing in a way that we could only describe as resurrection, what if that's what we were building together, a place for that kind of God to show up? Because that's what they thought they were doing. Sometimes it can be uncomfortable to see each other and to be able to offer affirmations and critiques in a way that would disarm our implicit bias. Lots of people avoid that, but what do we get when we are on the other side of that? A place where this God who is truly satisfying to know will actually dwell with us in deeper and richer ways. And so we're building a community where we can know and see each other. And we're building a conception of God where he is worth following. He is worth showing up for. And in the end, what we are doing is we're building a place for God to dwell. And here's how I think this works. There's a lot of study now on white culture in organizational leadership. And so that was an example of how this worked in the ancient world, but how might the diverse conversations transform the way we conceive of our world? One of the ways that they say subtle white instincts show up in business is to say bigger is always better, and we should expand at all costs. Now, that's really hard to think of as a church, because of course I would love for Dwell Church to be bigger. Of course I would love for this to keep expanding. It isn't that growth and expansion are bad, it is that there is an instinct in our world that you and I have felt, that the environmental impact of is felt by all of us, that there is a way that we should grow at all costs, no matter what the future holds. And we have all been able to identify that, I think, quite instinctually in our world. In fact, that was part of the original mandate for America, westward expansion. Manifest destiny. God himself said that this should keep growing. Now, it's interesting that in my world, churches were often built that way. That a bigger church was thought of as a more godly church. And that if a church was growing rapidly, no matter what the collateral damage might be, that must be an act of God. It was programmed with this very operating system that it has to expand at all costs. And if it isn't expanding, well, we have to ask what went wrong. And it turns out that a lot of heartbreak in our world was dealt into our communities by churches that were growing on the outside and maybe not so much in their hearts or in the shape or texture of the presence of Jesus there. They were working with this exact same operating system that growing at any cost must be worth it. The means justify the ends. And I've worked in some of those churches, and at the time I was telling this exact story. Well, if it's growing, it must be good, right? But looking back on the gigantic churches that have been built in our world, the story of all of those churches, they were filled with so many amazing people just like you. And yet the system, the culture, the assumptions available to them at the time were to build it as quickly and as hugely as anyone could conceive of, no matter what the consequences were. Now, it's interesting that there is a solution that the thinkers who are criticizing these workplace kind of assumptions, they offer to us, called seventh generation thinking. This was a indigenous peoples concept. The Iroquois coined this term that every person making a leadership decision has to think 7 generations in the future. It's 150 years in that conception. What if all of our organizations in our world were led with one thing in mind? How do 150 years from now, how are we blessing those people? I can't even think of one organization that is led that way. Maybe they exist. Maybe the disinfectant wipes called seventh generation. Maybe they're doing that. Maybe. I don't know. But I don't know of any company that has a reputation for saying all we do is think 7 generations in the future. Now, looking across the landscape of churches in our world, part of what we have wanted to do as a church is root for them. We want to root for other churches. They are doing what God has called them to do in their perception, and they're full of amazing people like you. And we're thinking about, what are we called to? And I honestly believe that we are called to think 150 years in the future. This is part of what we have meant when we have said we want to be a new church for a new era. If you've been to some of our vision and fundraising events, they are so life-giving because we sit down together and we say, what is the church going to be like in 500 years? And at first people say, well, are there still humans? And we say, yeah, of course. Okay, it's a thought experiment. There's still humans. We figured out climate change. The robots haven't taken over. They're still followers of Jesus. What are they doing? And it unleashes this hopeful conversation about the best parts of what it means to be a Christian. And there's some of the most life-giving things that Dwell Church has done because we embraced this idea instinctually that we have to think deeper into the future when we're building organizations. And it is a counterfactual, hypothetical thing to say, what if early on in American history they learned from the indigenous peoples that you're supposed to think deeply in the future when you're making present-day decisions? What would have been different? Well, everything would have been different. But we can't ever prove that. But what we can say is, this is the kind of learning that we have to do from each other. Because it doesn't destroy the businesses in question here, hypothetically. It makes them better and sharper and more effective. And so part of what we are thinking about is, how do we embrace the position that our human bodies live in? And for me, that has been really specifically, especially in this series, I'm just a cisgendered white dude. But it's really freeing to say that. Because all of the ways we might need to deconstruct some of these types of thinkings, I didn't do that. But it is part of the world that I live in. It is part of the way the intersectional identity occurs in me. And it is freeing to say, this is just the cards I was dealt. Now let's build a better world. And in the end, that's all we're dreaming about. That's all we're called to do by the person of Jesus. So as we live into this kind of diversity, when we live into these kinds of conversations, we're going to have some uncomfortable conversations as we learn to see each other, as we learn to listen, and as we learn to be filled more with the presence and power of the Spirit. This isn't something I invented. This isn't something that only happened in 2020. This is something that's been going on for thousands of years, that diverse communities have been asking the presence of Jesus to show up and to make them into one people that could love each other by listening. And here's what I think we get. There's this strange idea in Christian history. And this is just one way of saying it from the psychologist David Benner. There's no deep knowing of God without a deep knowing of yourself. And no deep knowing of yourself without a deep knowing of God. When we go on this journey of embracing our identities and putting them into conversation with each other, what do we get? We get a deeper, more intimate knowledge of who we actually are and who God actually is. And that's my prayer for us. Okay, as we've been doing in this series, I'm going to invite your friend of mine, Otzi Gates, to come on up. I've given them full permission to disagree, agree, and everything in between. Grab one of those microphones so we can get it on the internet and have at it, buddy.
Is this microphone on? Okay, cool. I'm going to give just 2 thoughts sort of in general about this. But Matt, that was really beautiful. I thought you did a great job. Loved it. I'll expand a little bit on the idea of 7 generations. I think Matt touched on it pretty well, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not just this idea of leadership. It's every person and every choice you make. Think about how that impacts people 7 generations past, but also recognize the ways in which you exist here now because of 7 generations previously. It comes from the Iroquois Nation. They had the oldest living participatory democracy. So everybody would have been making all decisions, which I think is a really cool way to also think about, like, in church. We're all contributing. So that, I kind of challenge everybody, not just in your leadership choices, but in everything you do. Like, how can you think about, what you're doing is affecting not just your kids, but their kids and their kids and their kids, and it goes on. And to take the wisdom that you've learned, through the generations that came before you, because we all have that. We all have things we've learned from our parents and their parents and their parents' parents. Even just culturally, if it's not like your direct descendants, right? There's a lot of beautiful knowledge that all of our cultures have, and I think that's part of what we need to bring to the table here in church, is that kind of generational knowledge, and then how do we use it and use what we're learning right now to move forward. And then my last thought was talking a little bit about Dr. Jennings, Matt was talking about, where he writes about these journals that the first, quote unquote missionaries came to the Americas as part of colonization, and they just don't see the people that they're interacting with as fully human. And part of what he talks about is how that's also a deeply, it was a religious thought, that they didn't see these people in a religious way as fully human. And I think as Christians, we really have to work through deconstructing all of these thoughts that have come before us. This idea of 7 generations of Christian thought before us, how is that impacting us now? And deconstruction has a lot of negative connotation in Christianity, but I think in this way it's so important to really work through. There's a lot of really racist, really sexist, really homophobic thought that exists in Christianity, and it's not often biblically rooted at all in anything. It comes from cultural beliefs. And so how can we now, as this church that wants to be diverse, wants to be affirming, wants to be inclusive, work through that in a way that's vulnerable and listening to each other, because a lot of people here have been affected by that thought, and so how can we really take that seriously? And so that's sort of my one thing I just really want to emphasize is that idea of, in order to get to this peaceful and truly healthy community, we have to take seriously deconstruction and take seriously listening to each other and being vulnerable. And when you're listening, also understanding that it's going to take genuine work on every single person's part. It doesn't matter, as a person who is diverse, there are so many implicit biases that I have, that I spend my whole life working through, that come from, community. There's a lot of things, the Mexican community has beliefs that are just not healthy, that you have to work through. And all of us have that, no matter who we are. And how can we work through it, both from a Christian lens and then sort of this cultural perspective together, to create these really beautiful, healthy communities, and get to that idea of in Revelations, where every tribe exists and all is praising God together. And that's the goal. I think that's kind of all I had. I thought you did a lovely job with all of it, so thank you. And if you have anything about intersectionality or any questions like that, feel free to talk to me, talk to Keo, talk to people about just questions you have. We're super open to having conversations about, the academic side of stuff too, so feel free.